Give Me Liberty, An American History by Eric Foner, 5th edition. Chapter 2 on page 57, discussing Jamestown and Virginia. Settling the Chesapeake, the Jamestown colony. The early history of Jamestown was, to say the least, not promising. The colony's leadership changed repeatedly. Its inhabitants suffered extraordinary high death rate, and with the company seeking a quick profit, supplies from England provided inadequate. The hopes of locating riches such as the Spanish had found in Mexico were quickly dashed. Silver and gold they have none, one Spanish observer commented. Their local resources were not much to be regarded, and they had no commerce with any nation. The first settlers were a quarrelsome band of gentlemen and servants. They included a few farmers and laborers and numerous sons of English gentry and high-status craftsmen, jewelers, stonecutters, and the like, who preferred to prospect for gold rather than farm. They would rather starve than work, declared John Smith, one of the colony's first leaders. Jamestown lay beside a swamp containing malaria-carrying mosquitoes, and the garbage settlers dumped into the local river bred germs that caused dysentery and typhoid fever. Disease and lack of food took a heavy toll. By the end of the first year, the original population of 104 had fallen by half. The new arrivals, including the first 2 women, had landed in 1608. They brought the numbers up to 400 in 1609, but by 1610, after a winter long remembered as the starving time, only 65 settlers remained alive. At one point, the settlers abandoned Jamestown and sailed for England, only to be intercepted and persuaded to return to Virginia by ships carrying a new governor, 250 colonists, and supplies. By 1616, about 80% of the immigrants who had arrived in the first decade were dead. Only rigorous military discipline held the colony together. John Smith was a forceful man whose career before coming to America included a period of fighting the Turks in Hungary, where he was captured for a time and enslaved. He imposed a regime of forced labor on company lands. He that will not work shall not eat, Smith declared. Smith's autocratic mode of governing alienated many of the colonists. After being injured in an accidental gunpowder explosion in 1609, he was forced to return to England, but his immediate successors continued his iron rule. From company to society. The Virginia Company slowly realized that for the colony to survive, it would have to abandon the search for gold, grow its own food, and find a marketable commodity. It would also have to attract more settlers. With this end in view, it announced new policies in 1618 that powerfully shaped Virginia's development as a functioning society rather than an outpost of London-based investors. Instead of retaining all the land for itself, the company introduced the headright system, awarding 50 acres of land to any colonist who paid for his own or another's passage. Thus, anyone who brought in a sizable number of servants would immediately acquire a large estate. In place of the governor's militaristic regime, a charter of grants and liberties was issued, including the establishment of a House of Burgesses. When it convened in 1619, this became the first elected assembly in colonial America. The House of Burgesses was hardly a model of democracy. Only freemen could vote, and the company and its appointed governor retained the right to nullify any measure the body adopted. But its creation established a political precedent that all English colonies would eventually follow. Also in 1619, the first 20 blacks arrived in Virginia on a Dutch vessel. The full significance of these 2 events would not be apparent until years later, but they laid the foundation for a society that would one day be dominated economically and politically by slave-owning planters. Powhatan and Pocahontas. When the English arrived at Jamestown, they landed in an area inhabited by some 15,000 to 25,000 Indians living in numerous small agricultural villages. Most acknowledged the rule of Wahusanacock, a shrewd and forceful leader who had recently consolidated his authority over the region and collected tribute from some 30 subordinate tribes. Called Powhatan by the settlers after the Indian word for both his tribe and his title of paramount chief, he quickly realized advantages of trade with the newcomers. For its part, mindful of Las Casas' condemnation of the Spanish behavior, the Virginia Company instructed its colonists to treat local Indians kindly and to try to convert them to Christianity. Realizing that the colonists depended on the Indians for food, John Smith tried to stop settlers from seizing produce from nearby villages, lest the Indians cut off all trade. In the first 2 years of Jamestown's existence, relations with Indians were mostly peaceful and based on a fairly equal give and take. At one point, Smith was captured by the Indians and threatened with execution by Powhatan, only to be rescued by Pocahontas, reputedly the favorite among his many children by dozens of wives. The incident has come down in legend, most recently a popular animated film, as an example of a rebellious, love-struck teenager defying her father. In fact, it was probably part of an elaborate ceremony designed by Powhatan to demonstrate his power over the colonists and incorporate them into his realm. Pocahontas subsequently became an intermediary between the two peoples, bringing food and messages to Jamestown. John Smith's return to England raised tensions between the two groups, and a period of sporadic conflict began in 1610, with the English massacring villagers indiscriminately and destroying Indian crops. Pocahontas herself was captured and held as a hostage by the settlers in 1613. While confined to Jamestown, she converted to Christianity. As part of the restoration of peace in 1614, she married the English colonist John Rolfe. 2 years later, she accompanied her husband to England, where she caused a sensation in the court of James I as a symbol of Anglo-Indian harmony and missionary success. But she succumbed to disease in 1617. Her father died the following year. The uprising of 1622. Once it became clear that the English were interested in establishing a permanent and constantly expanding colony, not a trading post, conflict with local Indians was inevitable. The peace that began in 1614 ended abruptly in 1622 when Powhatan's brother and successor, Pocahontas, led a brilliantly planned surprise attack in a single day, wiped out 1/4 of Virginia's settler population of 1,200. The surviving 900 colonists organized themselves into military bands, which then massacred scores of Indians and devastated their villages. A spokesman for the Virginia Company explained the reason behind the Indian assault: the daily fear that, in time, we, by our growing continually upon them, would dispose them of this country. But by going to war, declared Governor Francis Wyatt, the Indians had forfeited any claim to the land. Virginia's policy, he continued, must now be nothing less than the expulsion of the savages to gain the free range of the country. Indians remained a significant presence in Virginia, and trade continued throughout the century, but the unsuccessful uprising of 1622 fundamentally shifted the balance of power in the colony. The settlers' supremacy was reinforced in 1644 when a last desperate rebellion led by Pocahontas, now said to be 100 years old, was crushed after causing the deaths of some 500 colonists. Virginia forced a treaty on the surviving coastal Indians, who now numbered fewer than 2,000, that acknowledged their subordination to the government at Jamestown and required them to move to tribal reservations to the west and not enter areas of European settlement without permission. This policy of separation followed the precedent already established in Ireland. Settlers spreading inland into the Virginia countryside continued to seize Indian lands. The destruction caused by the uprising of 1622 was the last in a series of blows suffered by the Virginia Company. 2 years later, it surrendered its charter, and Virginia became the first royal colony, its governor now appointed by the Crown. Virginia had failed to accomplish any of its goals for either the company or the settlers. Investors had not turned a profit, and although the company had sent 6,000 settlers to Virginia, its white population numbered only 1,200 when the king assumed control. Preoccupied with affairs at home, the government in London for years paid little attention to Virginia. Henceforth, the local elite, not a faraway company, controlled the colony's development, and that elite was growing rapidly in wealth and power thanks to the cultivation of a crop introduced from the West Indies by John Rolfe: tobacco. The Tobacco Company King James I considered tobacco harmful to the brain and dangerous to the lungs, and issued a spirited warning against its use. But increasing numbers of Europeans enjoyed smoking and believed the tobacco plant had medicinal benefits. As a commodity with an ever-expanding mass market in Europe, tobacco became Virginia's substitute for gold. It enriched an emerging class of tobacco planters, as well as members of the colonial government who assigned good land to themselves. The crown profited from custom duties, taxes on tobacco that entered or left the kingdom. By 1624, more than 200,000 pounds were being grown, producing startling profits for landowners. 40 years later, the crop totaled 15 million pounds, and it doubled again by the 1680s. The spread of tobacco farming produced a dispersed society with few towns and a little social unity. It inspired a get-rich-quick attitude and a frenzied scramble for land and labor. By the middle of the 17th century, a new influx of immigrants with ample financial resources, sons of merchants and English gentlemen, had taken advantage of the headright system and governmental connections to acquire large estates along navigable rivers. They established themselves as the colony's social and political elite. The expansion of tobacco cultivation also led an increased demand for field labor, met for most of the 17th century by young male indentured servants. Despite harsh conditions of work in the tobacco fields, a persistently high death rate, and laws mandating punishments from whipping to an extension of service for those who ran away or who were unruly, the abundance of land continued to attract migrants. Of the 120,000 English immigrants who entered the Chesapeake region during the 17th century, 3/4 came as servants. Virginia's white society increasingly came to resemble that of England, with a wealthy, lauded gentry at the top, a group of small farmers, mostly former indentured servants who had managed to acquire land, in the middle, and an army of poor laborers, servants, and landless former indentured servants at the bottom. By 1700, the region's white population had grown to 90,000 peoples. Women and the family. Virginia, however, lacked one essential element of English society: stable family life. The colony avidly promoted the immigration of women, including several dozen tobacco brides who arrived in 1620 and 1621 for arranged marriages. But given the demand for male servants to work in the tobacco fields, men in the Chesapeake outnumbered women for most of the 17th century by 4 or 5 to 1. The vast majority of women who immigrated to the region came as indentured servants. Since they usually had to complete their terms of service before marrying, they did not begin to form families until their mid-20s. The high death rate, unequal ratio between the sexes, and late age of marriage for those who found partners retarded population growth and produced a society with a large number of single men, widows, and orphans. Although patriarchal ideals remained intact in Virginia, in practice the traditional authority of husbands and fathers was weakened. Because of their own low life expectancy, fathers found it difficult to supervise the careers and marriages of their children. In the colonies, as in England, a married woman possessed certain rights before the law, including a claim to dower rights of 1/3 of her husband's property in the event that he died before she did. When the widow died, however, the property passed to the husband's male heirs. English law was far less generous than in Spain, where a woman could hold independently any property inherited from her parents, and a man and wife owned jointly all the wealth accumulated during a marriage. Social conditions in the colonies, however, opened the door to roles women rarely assumed in England. Widows and a few women who never married took advantage of their legal status as a woman alone who enjoyed an independent legal identity denied to married women, who make contracts and conduct business. Margaret Brent, who immigrated to the Chesapeake in 1638, acquired land, managed her own plantation, and acted as a lawyer in court. Some widows were chosen to administer their husbands' estates or were willed their husband's property outright, rather than receiving only 1/3 dower rights. But because most women came to Virginia as indentured servants, they could look forward only to a life of hard labor in the tobacco fields and early death. Servants were frequently subjected to sexual abuse by their masters. Those who married often found themselves in poverty when their husband died.